graduated debt-free. And I doubt that there's 1 in 10 of you here today that will be able to say that when you graduate from school, you will legitimately be able to have that confidence and without several $1,000s in debt hanging over your head. And I should also say that in the time that I was in school, we had the entire younger generation convulsed in a collective struggle against racism, against sexism, and against the Vietnam War. And now, your generation, as well as mine, is facing a massive attack of more of a directly economic nature. And you will be forced, many of you, to engage in a similar kind of collective struggle. And in the process of that struggle, it's going to be necessary to understand what lies at the heart of the problems that you are confronting and that you are trying to deal with. And I think we have to, first of all, there's one note that I should make, which is in talking about the system that we live under, the economic and social system of capitalism, we should understand that when human beings first got together, the reason that they got together was to organize production of the necessities of life. Whether that was in a small tribal group that went out and hunted and gathered, or whether it is under modern day capitalism. And one of the things that determined how they organized that production was what were the means of production that was at their disposal. Whether it was a few rocks that they chipped together to make an arrowhead, or whether it is making modern computers and factories and so on. And the level of development of that means of production is what is the essential, not the only, but lies at the root of how they organize production and distribution of goods. And based on that, different means of organizing that production were devised. And the first means of organizing it as a class society was slavery. And then feudalism was developed and overthrew slavery, and that was a step forward. And then, as the means of production were developed further, then there was a new class that developed, the capitalist class, that led the overthrow of feudalism. And that was a huge step forward at that time. And so therefore, just when viewed from a historical vantage point, you can see that capitalism is merely a means of organizing production and distribution of the necessities of life, a means of organizing it that is based on the level of development of the forces of production that existed at the time that capitalism came into being. And every single social system has contained within it the seeds of its own destruction. Just like a flower, as it's pollinated, has within it the seeds of its own destruction, so does the different economic and social systems. And what we have to understand is what, in other words, its own laws of motion, its own internal contradictions. What are the internal contradictions, the laws of motion of capitalism itself? And the first one flows from the fact that you have private ownership of the means of production versus socialized production. And what that leads to, on the one hand, is a tendency to overproduction. In other words, workers cannot buy back all of what they produce. Another internal contradiction that flows from capitalism is a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. That doesn't mean that every year, year in and year out, we're not talking about the absolute amount of profit, but the percentage return on the dollar invested tends to fall, and statistics have backed up that tendency, have confirmed that also. Then you have the issue of the existence of the nation states, which capitalism cannot do without, in the era of world production and world distribution of goods. And the nation states tend to block and also to destabilize this further development of world production. And if you just look at all the different problems with the different national currencies in the era of world production, which destabilizes world production and prevents it from really being further developed, and there's no going back to the past, despite the fantasies of many on the far right, that is another internal contradiction of capitalism itself. Incidentally, also, you see, because of this issue of the nation states, every rising capitalist country, for instance, has to have its own steel industry, has to have its own automobile industry. You see China now is developing an aeronautics industry. And This just simply exacerbates the tendency to overproduction, which I explained.
Is there a time limit on each speaker, or do they speak?
Yes.
10 minutes.
How long do they speak?
10 minutes.
So, how does the capitalist class respond to these contradictions? On the one hand, they try to boost their profits by cutting back on wages and cutting back on labor. And that only exacerbates the problem of the tendency to overproduction. Incidentally, today's Wall Street Journal, as usual, has a couple articles explaining present economic developments which confirms this. Now the other thing is, because of the lack of profits and the profitable markets, they tend to go more and more into speculation rather than bothering with that uncomfortable necessity of actually producing something in order to swell their coffers. And you see in the United States, from 1950 to 2001, manufacturing went from 29% down to 12% of the total economy, while financial services, that is to say speculation, went from a little under 11% up to 20.4% of the total economy. And incidentally, while manufacturing today is 12% of the gross domestic product, the total economy, it only generates 3% of the total profits. Whereas financial services, which as I said is slightly over 20%, it generates 45% of the total profits. This is why, not because of something to do with the Fed or anything like that, that you have an economy that's based itself more and more on just speculation, which means fewer jobs at decent pay for every single one of you here. Another means of getting around this tendency towards overproduction is massive increase in debt. Individual debt, including the debt that you owe as students, corporate debt, and government debt. And the whole debt in U.S. society today is about 300% of the total gross domestic product. Now the right-wing critics say that, that we have to return to, basically what it amounts to is the return to the policies of Herbert Hoover in order to solve this crisis. And they blame the Fed and the debt for this crisis. But these things are merely a symptom of the crisis. And we should also note that there's a long history of all kinds of simplistic, wild schemes as far as changing money supply and the currencies and all of that sort of thing. There's a long history of that which plays to the kind of pragmatism of U.S. society. And all of these things have been proven in the past to be a complete failure, and the present so-called solutions will be also. The fact is that now, as you move into struggling against the effects of this crisis, that you're going to have to deal with the cause, the root cause of the crisis, which in just a few minutes I've tried to lay out before you. And what we as Marxists and as socialists would put forward is that instead of bailing out the banks, you can't just let everything collapse, as the right wing claims. That was the policies of Herbert Hoover. But what we would say is that private ownership has proven that it cannot deal with the banks and with finances in a way that benefits the great majority in society. Therefore, take it out of private hands, put it under public ownership, under the direct control and management of the workers themselves, and that way we can plan where investment will go in society, what kind of housing investment should go to, what kind of education it should go to, and so on, in a way that will benefit society as a whole. And that then would have to be linked with the same sort of demand for the commanding heights of the economy as a whole. We're not talking about every little mom and pop grocery store. But what we are talking about is the giant corporations, from Lucky's and Safeway to General Motors